A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dhananath Fernando. I warmly welcome all of you on behalf of Advocata Institute. I would like to welcome specially our speaker today, Professor Robert Lawrence, and the moderator for the Q&A session, Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, Honorable Harsha De Silva, Ambassador of Switzerland, His Excellency Mr. Heinz Walker Niederkorn, Board of Advisors for Advocata Institute, Professor Rohan Samarjeeva, Dr. Nishan Dimel, and Mrs. Anakali Munasinghe, subscribers and supporters of Advocata, representatives from the Diplomatic Corps, the academics, members from the civil society, representatives from press and media, my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome all of you for this special session on path to prosperity, free trade, or protectionism. However, for this session could not have been a possibility without the support from our subscribers and the kind and generous supporters of Advocata. Those who hear Advocata name for the first time, we are a free market think tank and we work towards a free, lawful, and harmonious society where we believe that hard work and free exchange should be able to make anyone succeed regardless of caste, creed, ethnicity, or any other discrimination factor. And we have a good news as well for those who are supporting Advocata. Advocata has been ranked for the second consecutive time in the Go to Think Tank Index by University of Pennsylvania as the upcoming best think tanks in the world in 2017 as well. So thank you very much for support for the last 2 years. We have been growing, and that has shown that the work that we have been done has been taken notice by the international world as well as the local world. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, and this session would be the first step of a series of projects that we are going to do on the broader topic of protectionism. So this is the first step, and you would see more projects from Advocata under the broad theme of protectionism. So with that, let me introduce the first speaker today. He has 20 years of business and capital market experience, the CEO of JB Securities, and he's also a founding member of Advocata. I cordially invite to speak on the special facts and remarks and the figures on trade and tariffs to Mr. Murtaza Jafferji. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and welcome Mr. Murtaza Jafferji.
Good evening. My role here is to set up the platform for today's discussion. Professor Robert Lawrence will give the keynote presentation today, but my role here is to give you a few facts and figures so that you can think about it for the question time. And I called it Dispelling Myths, Illuminating Facts, and a bit of everything. The first myth, countries that export a lot import a lot, which is... So let's look at a few examples. Vietnam, 93 million population, about 5 times larger than us in size, per capita of about 2,100. Our one is coming close to 4,000. Their exports 100% of GDP, imports 96%. This number for Sri Lanka for merchandise is about 12 or 14% for exports. And it's about 4 to 5% more for imports. So what do they export? The left-hand side shows you what they export. And you can see that there's a lot of electronic products. Samsung has a huge factory in Vietnam, $260 billion. To give it some context, our merchandise exports is about 11 billion. And they import about $197 billion. Now, this color scheme, which is a tree chart, kind of buckets it. The light blues are machinery items. And you can see that some of the exports are backed by imports, and it looks like a lot of components are coming in. Similarly, look at textiles, the red part. There's a lot of imports also coming in. This shows you Vietnam's performance over the years. So in 1996, they probably exported about $3 to $4 billion, and today they export over $200 billion. And also notice the composition of exports, how it has changed. Look what they're importing. So it looks like they're importing a lot of stuff that goes into the re-export. Next country, Taiwan. So Vietnam has a per capita less than us. Taiwan is a original Asian tiger, $22,000 per capita GDP, which is about 5 times more than us. 70% of GDP is exports, 51% is imports. So what do they export? A lot of high value added electronics, machinery, but they import a lot of that stuff also. This is how their exports have grown over the same period. And this is how their imports. So you can see that their imports are skewed towards a lot of fuel and energy. Next question, country is Switzerland, highly developed country, per capita GDP $80,000, small country in Europe, exports 47% of GDP, imports 41%. Again, remember the figure I gave, Sri Lanka for merchandise exports about 14%, imports about 19%. What do they export? Gold. Biggest export is gold. But they import a lot of gold also. So the value addition may be small, but it's the largest component of their trade basket. But look at the diversification of their exports. Switzerland, about 8 million people. People know them for chocolates. But Logitech is a Swiss company. Roche is a Swiss company, pharmaceutical giant. Swatch is a Swiss company. What do they? How have they performed in terms of exports? And you can see the dip here. The dip that you see is the fall in the price of gold. There was a huge bull market in gold, and there was a contraction. That explains that dip. Similarly, in imports, this is Sri Lanka, us, 3,800. This is a few years ago. 14% of GDP is exports, and imports is 24%. So ours is 11 billion, significant skew towards garments, but you don't have the corresponding imports in garments also. You have them in the red area. And this is our export basket. So remember I showed you Vietnam had about 4 billion, has gone to 200 billion. In that same period, we had about 3.5 billion, which has grown to 11 billion. So they have grown something like 50x. Of course, they came from a low base because the country opened out. But we went 3x, 3.5x. And this is what our imports look like. Again, you can see there's a big skew due to fuel. So the volatility in petroleum prices has a big impact on the import value basket. The next myth is bilateral trade balances are not as a measure of economic prowess. So there, you see in the popular press that they cite that our trade balance with a specific country is large. I have seen even Trump saying that, President Trump also saying that. But what matters is your total trade balance and not the bilateral trade balance. So let us see a few examples. Again, Vietnam. The blue is exports, the gray is imports, and the red is the trade balance. So for example, they have a trade deficit with China, large one, but they have a large trade deficit with the US. Similarly, a trade deficit with South Korea, and perhaps the trade deficits are a bit smaller with some of the other countries. And what matters is the net result. Look at the right-hand side. Taiwan. Taiwan also has trade deficits with a few countries. They import a lot of high-end machinery and components from Japan, but it's an exceptional country that it has phenomenal trade performance. This is Switzerland. So Switzerland also runs trade deficits with Germany, its neighbors, Italy. Of course, the UAE is more petroleum, and the end result is it still has a total trade surplus. So why do small countries need to trade more? This is something I mentioned to Professor Lawrence that we would like him to explain to us, perhaps in his speech or the discussion. But let me give you some numbers. Okay, this hung. The machine hung. One second. Okay, just bear with me, please. Okay, in case it gets stuck, I'll leave it like this. So you can look at these small countries, the top half of the table, and you can see the export performance, and the combination of exports and imports is the final column. So you can see that small countries as a percentage of GDP trade a lot. And look at the number for Singapore, it's 318%. But the bigger countries, obviously, because the domestic economies are so much bigger, as a percentage of GDP, their trade is smaller. Now, to give you some context, Sri Lanka, if you look at merchandise trade, that one showed 14 plus 24. So you add the two, you get about 38% of GDP, while these countries are all over 100%. Okay, so something about border taxes. Okay, so this is a stylized example showing you how tariffs work. And the 100% is the CIF value. And generally, the highest rate of tariffs that we have here is 30% on customs duty. The VAT rate is 15%. And in this particular case, in this example, we have used steel rods, which has about a cess of 21%. The PAL is 7.5% and NBT. So PAL and cess is what is classified as para tariffs. What you see on the right hand side is the cumulative effects, because some of these para tariffs, when you apply VAT, etc., there's a cascading impact on it. And you can see that for steel rods, it's 90% the total taxes. If you take out the cess, which is para tariffs, which is outside the WTO agreement, the total tax comes down to 63. And if you take the PAL out, it comes down to 54. And if you take the customs duty, it comes down to 19%. So it's just a stylized example of the impact of all these different tariffs. So let's look at some common things that you consume. Recognize this? Total taxes 108%. Minus para tariffs, it comes down to 54%. Now the question is, why do you need 54% para tariffs on chocolates? Your Snicker bar would be a lot cheaper. Not that it's healthier to eat, but it will be a lot easier on your pocket. And if you remove the customs duty, you're left with 19. And where did the 19 come? That's your 15% VAT plus 2% NBT with the cascading impact. Recognize this? These are American Oreo cookies, but you get many other imported biscuits. Total taxes 108%. Minus para tariff, similarly 54%. And minus, if you remove the customs duty also, it comes down to 19%. Recognize these things? Also, minus para tariffs, it comes down to 72. There is a small error here. This should be 94. And if you take the customs duty out, it comes down to 19. And these are tiles. Again, 108%. Without the para tariffs, is 54. And if you take the duty out also, it comes down to 19%. I just wanted to illustrate the impact that these border taxes are having. Now, VAT and NBT are not border taxes because they don't discriminate between imports and domestic producers. This is another example. Tar steel, which goes into reinforcements of all concrete structures. It's a must. And with more and more high-density housing happening in urban areas, you need more and more steel. Total taxes 90%. Tar steel was perhaps invented or manufactured by Andrew Carnegie about 150 years ago, but we have total taxes of 90%. Without para tariffs, it comes down to 54%. So one asks a question, why are these so high? So the question is, this revenue that is one of the reasons that the government needs revenue. So if we reduce these border taxes, what will be the impact on government revenue? On the right-hand side, it's a stack column chart of where government revenues come from. And this is for 2016. Funnily, 13% came from motor vehicles. They didn't get the same number in 2017 because the tariffs went up. Fuel taxes are a significant amount, especially the excise alone on fuel taxes. There are some other taxes also on fuel, but this is only the excise duty, which is a production tax. Then you have cess, which is a para tariff, and a whole gamut of other taxes. And some of the gentlemen from the Harvard team did some kind of basic sensitivity analysis, and they have identified that the top 5 HS code items account for 30% of import taxes. The top 15, 50%, and the top 100, 75, form a total basket of about 5,500. So it's the 80-20 rule, or even it's more like a 5-95% rule. And the final point is about global value chains. This shows you about a car in Costa Rica. The car is made by Daewoo, Korean company. And just take a moment to see where the different components come from. So seldom do countries manufacture everything themselves. There are big value chains operating. And the second part is that a lot of trade happens within multinationals. We think that India exports a lot of cars to Sri Lanka, right? We get a lot of imported cars. This is Sri Lanka, 2%. But their biggest export market for cars is Mexico. How on earth does India export cars, 24% of their total exports of 6 billion, to Mexico? The reason is on top. So these transnational, multinational companies operate in multiple countries, and therefore they have production centers for different models. So a lot of small size cars which are targeted at the Indian market are exported by these people with a slightly different model but the same manufacturer. So this is a graphic example of these intra-firm trade. So on that note, I will end my presentation. My apologies for the technical problems, but I hope I have been able to give you a flavor to set this up for Professor Robert Lawrence's talk.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. Now, I'm deeply honored and sincerely privileged to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Robert Lawrence. Professor Robert Lawrence is Albert L. Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment, a senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He currently serves as a faculty chair of the Practice of Trade Policy Executive Team at Harvard Kennedy School. He serves as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1998 to 2000. Professor Lawrence has also been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has taught at Yale University, where he received his PhD in economics. His research focuses on trade policy. Ladies and gentlemen, join me welcoming Professor Robert Lawrence.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today. I am going to pick up a number of themes which have already been laid out by the previous speaker, Mr. Murtaza. I'm going to start very briefly by talking about the gains from trade. In a sense, the theme that I was given to talk about is free trade versus protection. And so what I wanted to do was to lay out the principal arguments on either side of that argument. And that's what I'll do. So I'll look at some of the sources of the gains from trade and then think about what would be the best case you could actually make for trade protection. After that, I will turn more specifically to the issue of what we call trade in tasks, trade in global value chains, think about the theory of trade using value chains, and then we'll look at some of specific applications for Sri Lanka. So that's basically my agenda. I hope to get through it in about half an hour. So if you want to ask people why should there be international trade, where do the gains from trade come from? The basic idea we owe to David Ricardo relates to this principle of comparative advantage. Now, how do you explain comparative advantage? I've tried many ways with many of my students, and I found a way that worked with my 90-year-old mother. And basically, the way to explain it is to ask the question, is it a good idea for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house? Let's assume that painting is a very unpleasant activity. So who thinks Mark Zuckerberg should paint his own house? Okay, so none of you. Let me ask you another question. Is it expensive for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house? Yes, you know, time, they say, is valuable. And Mark's time is very, very valuable. But you see, there's actually something you don't know about Mark Zuckerberg. He's a very good house painter. Actually, I'm showing you a picture here of George, who's a very typical house painter, and Mark could actually paint his house just as well in half the time it would take George to paint his house. So now let me ask you, would you revise your opinion? How many of you think now, knowing about George, should Mark Zuckerberg paint his own house? We have a couple of people who believe he ought to, but you can see most people would think it's still very expensive for Mark Zuckerberg to paint his own house, isn't it? So that's basically a reasonable question to ask. Now, suppose I turn the question around and I ask you, should George develop his own software? Now, we don't know a lot about George, but let's assume he's kind of more or less like you or me, and think how long it would take him to develop Facebook and all those applications which can be used on Facebook. And you could imagine that could be very, very expensive for George to develop his own software. So in fact, George probably would be better off painting and then using some of his money that he earns to buy software. So that basically shows you the principles of comparative and absolute advantage. And in this example, it's clear. Who has absolute advantage? Well, it's Mark. Mark has an absolute advantage in developing software. Mark has an absolute advantage in house painting. But what we notice is there is a difference when it comes to comparative advantage. Because in fact, each of them has a comparative advantage. Mark has a comparative advantage in software development, and George has a comparative advantage in house painting. And while, it's rather difficult to have absolute advantages in everything, it's not so hard to have a comparative advantage. I'm a pretty bad tennis player, but I'm an even worse golfer. So at least I have a comparative advantage in playing tennis. And the same is true of countries. It's very hard to be absolutely good at everything, but comparatively, you're going to be better at some things than at others. So then the question is, how do we know where our comparative advantage lies? Should we go out and hire McKinsey in order to tell us, what exactly is our comparative advantage? Well, it turns out there's an easier way to know what your comparative advantage is, and that is to think about if your country was isolated, what would be relatively cheap and what would be relatively expensive. We've already gone through that exercise for George, George and for Mark. What we know is that in Mark's world, it's very expensive for him to try to develop, to paint his own house. Okay, it's cheap for him to develop software, because the only thing he gives up when he develops software is the opportunity to paint his own house. Conversely, in George's world, it's very expensive for him to try to develop software, but it's cheap for him to do painting. And so the general principle is, if something is very expensive in your world, what should you do? Should you export it or import it? You should import it. And that's why Mark Zuckerberg should not paint his own house, because it's very expensive for him to paint his own house, because he's given up the opportunity to develop software. That's why George shouldn't be engaged in trying to develop his own software because it's very expensive for him to develop the software, whereas painting is much better for him to do. So the basic principle that we get is if countries are different, as long as countries are different in autarky when they're isolated, as long as the relative prices in those countries are different, they ought to specialize in the things that are relatively cheap and sell those and thereby buy the goods that are relatively expensive. That's the essence of why there are gains from international trade. Now, there's always the person who says, well, if this is the prescription, what you're basically telling George to do is for his whole life he should be a house painter. And you're telling countries who have a comparative advantage in certain kinds of things like house painting that they should just keep on painting houses. And we're going to explore in a moment, so what if they could change their comparative advantage? But basically this is the essence of why we think there are gains from trade, and the gains will be greatest if we trade with countries that are most different from us. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Now suppose it turns out actually the countries aren't different. Suppose they were identical. Could they gain from international trade? Can similar countries gain from trade? And actually the answer is they can, because there's a different kind of trade. You see, if you look at the patterns of trade between Chicago and New York, or in this case between Canada and the United States, you'll see Canada sells cars to the United States, and the United States sells cars to Canada. So why is that? Well, there are two reasons, and they both need to hold for there to be gains from trade between similar countries. The first reason is that people like variety. You know, if you go and look at your closet, what you'll discover is all your shirts aren't the same, all your skirts aren't the same. You like a variety of things. As long as people have a taste for variety, that's one part of it. And secondly, to produce the varieties is costly. So there are economies of scale in producing varieties. Henry Ford understood this when he said, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants as long as it's black. That's because Henry Ford knew that to produce the cars especially in those days, in many different colors, was going to be costly. So it turns out then that because we have a taste for variety, and because the provision of variety is costly, there can be gains from trade in similar products. Americans will have a taste for Mercedes-Benzes, and Germans will have a taste for Chevrolets and Fords. And we will see that a lot of trade involves trade in similar products within the same industry, but differentiated. And so the conclusion is there are gains from trade when countries are very different, and that's typically the kind of trade we get between a developed and developing country. And there are gains from trade at similar levels of income between countries that are quite similar, because they're likely to like the same kind of things, and each can exploit the scale economies. So it seems like a no-brainer. There are going to be gains from trade. Let's stop protecting and let the market work. Well, it turns out not so fast, because there's many things that markets are good at, but there are some times when markets don't perfectly allocate resources, when there is what we call market failure. And in essence, one classic market failure occurs when there are scale economies, but not at the level of the firm, but at the level of the market. Now, you've all been to markets. And actually, there's something very curious if you go to a market. What you'll find in a market is that people who are selling very similar kinds of products tend to congregate near each other. So these people are all selling clothing, and they're all sitting next to each other. And these people are selling hats, or food rather. It's a bad picture. And you can see they're all sitting next to each other. And it's not just in markets. It's true of cities. How many of you have been to New York? Okay, it turns out not many. Well, in New York, the collection of people and restaurants tends to be highly concentrated. So there's a place in New York which is Chinatown. And so if I asked you if we wanted to go and eat Chinese food, where would we go? The chances are we'll go to Chinatown. But say, where do we want to get Italian food? Anybody know? Not a lot of people who've been there. You'll go to Little Italy. Look, I'm sure in Colombo, you give me the right answers. And it turns out if you looked at Colombo, I promise you, if you wanted plumbing supplies, there's some place that you'll go to where you will find a lot of stores selling plumbing supplies. And if you want automobiles, there's another place where a lot of the car dealers are sitting next to each other. Now that's quite puzzling, isn't it? You'd think if you were selling the same product, you'd want to be as far away from your competition as possible. But in fact, what we see is people congregate next to each other when they're selling the same kind of products. So that means, since there's more intense competition sitting near one another, there must be some offsetting benefits. So I gave you the example of Chinese food. So why are all these Chinese food restaurants so close to each other? Well, just think about the mental experiment we've just gone through. One reason is the demand for Chinese food is bigger there. And that's why the firms want to be there. A second possibility is, one of my favorite Chinese meals is Peking duck. Now, if you wanted to get some ducks and you were operating a restaurant in New York City, well, you have to call up someone in Long Island and say, come and deliver the ducks. The person will say to you, where are you? And if you say to him, I'm in Chinatown, he says, well, that's great because, there are 20 restaurants in Chinatown and I drive down there every day with my trucks. So in fact, the cost of supplies is cheaper in Chinatown because there are so many firms. And what we see when we look around the world is that there are tremendous gains from being close. And these are agglomeration economies. And in a sense, they're not ones that can be captured by any single firm, but they are captured by many firms, precisely because they're congregating close to each other. Now, why am I taking you through this whole analysis? It's because this is the essence of the infant industry argument. What we're saying is that the costs will tend to decline the more firms we have in the marketplace. Okay? So imagine this describes the world, and suppose that we're talking about semiconductors. Now, suppose that in the beginning, this is what's happened to the supply of semiconductors in the world. The only semiconductors are being made in the United States. Semiconductors were invented by Bell Labs in the US, and they start to make semiconductors, and because there are a large number of firms, this is the supply of semiconductors in the world. Now let's suppose there's a second hypothetical country. We'll call it, so that's going to be the world price. Now suppose there's a second hypothetical country. We'll call this one South Korea. Okay? Now suppose South Korea's costs would be lower than the United States if it could come up to scale in that production. Okay. So in fact, the South Koreans, in a sense, have an advantage over the Americans. Just suppose they're better engineers than Americans. Now let's think about the first South Korean firm, and it's thinking about whether or not it should enter the marketplace. That firm is going to have the cost CO, and that firm is going to compare its cost to the world price. And it's going to say, hey, I'm not competitive. All right, so will Korea ever get into the semiconductor industry? No. But in fact, what we can see is that Korea has the potential to be more competitive than the US in the semiconductor industry. Now, the Korean government has a brainwave, and they say, we are going to forbid people to import semiconductors into Korea. So we're going to close the Korean marketplace. So let's suppose that this is what happens, and this is the demand for semiconductors in Korea. Well, if that's the case, then the internal price in Korea is going to be PK1. Now, is this a good or a bad outcome? Well, we're now getting semiconductors produced in Korea, but there's still a problem. Because these firms are not competitive in the world market. Korea's domestic demand is too small to generate the scale economies that are required to turn it into a world-class competitor. This is an infant that is never going to grow up. Okay, but suppose I got it wrong and the demand was big enough. Suppose the demand is actually DK2. In that case, as more and more firms enter the Korean marketplace, the Koreans are going to become more and more efficient, and suddenly they're going to turn around and notice that their costs are lower than the world price. So they not only are going to be servicing the domestic market, they could service the international market. So here is a case of infant industry protection, which generates a competitive industry that can ultimately be competitive in the world market. That, in a sense, is the case for trade protection. What you have to understand, though, is you need to be sure the government who protects needs to be very smart, because it needs to know that the domestic market is big enough to ultimately make the industry globally competitive. It also needs to know that there are market failures sufficient so that the private firms won't enter on their own. And when I look around and people tell me, I ask them from countries like Sri Lanka, why are you protecting your domestic industry? They say, oh, infant industry argument. And then my response is, yes, in theory, perhaps. But did you do the calculations? Did you know whether you're going to land up with an infant that's never going to grow up, which is going to be permanently protected, and, by the way, make things expensive for all the users of electronics who need semiconductors in their production? Or is this an industry in which ultimately you can become globally competitive? And if you have a small country, the chances of you generating those scale economies are not all that great. So, I am not saying that there couldn't be a case for some form of infant industry protection, but I would say the government needs to be really smart. It really needs to identify whether or not ultimately it will be globally competitive. Otherwise, like Mark Zuckerberg, countries should not try to paint their own houses. Okay, I had some mathematics and so on. I guess I'll just go through this principle. We saw the pictures of global supply chains. You saw a picture of an automobile that was made in many countries. Now, suppose that the final price of the car, the one that we saw, where was it built, your car?
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica. Let's suppose that at world prices, the final price of the car is $10,000. The price of parts is $8,000, and value added in the car is $2,000. So I'm just assuming this, if the whole car was produced efficiently. Now suppose the government puts a 10% tariff on cars. Okay? Well, the final price of the car is going to go up to $11,000. We know the car parts that are imported into the country will still cost $8,000. So it sounds like it's not much protection. It's only a 10% tariff. But in fact, if we look at the value addition, we see now the value that could be added is now gone up from $2,000 to $3,000. This 10% tariff on the final product, combined with the ability to import parts, is the equivalent of a 50% subsidy to the assembly of cars in this country. We say this is a 50% rate of effective protection. Now, this could either be taken up by inefficient production, or it could be surplus profits to the firm. But either way, what you can see is you can't just look at the tariff rate. You have to understand the entire tariff structure, because if the firms have access to inputs at cheap prices, at world prices, then even though the tariff doesn't seem to be that high, it could actually you could be conferring huge subsidies on the firms. So here you can see some examples from Sri Lanka. And these are this is from a government webpage, but these are the products which have import tariffs. Here's processing and preserving of fruits and vegetables. You're giving them a 92.9% nominal tariff protection. But when you take into account the inputs that they get, the effective rate of protection is 523%. That's the protection you're giving to this product. Bakery products, it's clear that the food products, but even if we go here, manufactured articles of concrete, cement, concrete. So think about all the buildings that are going on in this city and in this country. It has a protection of effectively 230%. Okay, so now let me take you through one more example. Imagine, again, these are the costs to build a car, but along comes the government, and what it does is it puts on a tariff of 10% on car parts. But it doesn't put any tariff on the final product. So what's going to happen is the final price of the car has still got to be $10,000. The price of the parts has gone up to $8,800. And so what we've got left for value added is $1,200. So we haven't protected now this sector. We have actually punished it. And we have a penalty, and the penalty is equal to something like 40% negative effective rate of protection. What's the name we give to products that have to be sold at world prices? What do we call those products? Can you tell me a product that has to be sold at a world price? Gold? Gold is an example. No. The name we call them is exports. You see, exports have to be sold at world prices. So when we put tariffs on inputs, what we are doing is taxing our exports. That is the single most important idea I would like to leave you. A tax on imports is a tax on exports. And this means that you shouldn't only look at your nominal tariff rates, you have to understand your tariff structure. And the most dangerous thing you can do if you ever want to be an exporter is to put tariffs on the inputs that the exporters have to use in exporting. Now, a lot of countries have figured this out, and that's why you have zones. Zones, in a sense, allow for duty-free inputs to come in. The only problem with the zone is you have to bring the imported inputs in to get that benefit. And if you try to use domestic inputs, you won't get the benefits. But nonetheless, that's one way people use it. So, just if we look at what's happened as a share of GDP to Sri Lanka's exports of goods and services, what you'll see was growing quite merrily until about 2000. But since 2000, as a share of GDP, it's gone down to 20%. And we can kind of ask, what has been going on here? Well, what we do know is what's happened to tariffs. And we know that these have been used to raise revenue, and you've invented kinds of tariffs. I've never even heard this word before, of a para-tariff. It's something unique, I think, to Sri Lanka, and the only part of your language I ever speak. So you see, you have this huge number of tariffs in the country. Now, and there's a lot of detail in this slide, but basically it shows how, and we saw in the earlier presentation, how you've accumulated all of these taxes on products. Now, just to show you a few more things in winding up. China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, what you'll notice is an amazing kind of correlation. The blue line is Chinese exports, and the red line is Chinese imports. And they're growing pretty rapidly before 2001. But after 2001, you see an acceleration for 5 years in both their exports and their imports. Now, just think about China joining the WTO. When China joined the WTO, the other countries did not open their markets to China. In fact, most countries were already giving China what's called most favored nation treatment. Now, the big change that happened in 2001 is China opened its market to imports. But what happened? Their exports soared. Yes, their imports grew, but you can also see how it generated increased exports. So, and in fact, there's a recent study put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they've gone into the details. And they have actually found the way in which the input tariff reductions had been associated with increased exports. Here's India. What you'll notice again is the correlation in the accelerations of their imports and their exports. Yes, they've run a bigger trade deficit, but it's again a very striking increase. This is Sri Lanka. Okay? This is the period when you increased your trade protection. Yes, your imports went down, but look at what happened to your exports. So this is why the central message, or one of the ideas that we would like to see promoted, is the notion that what you need is tariff reform. And you need to move to a system of very simple and significantly lower tariffs. We are not saying you should move there overnight in the sense, but you should have a long-run agenda in which you move to a much more simple system with significantly lower tariffs. Our suggestion is to have 3 bands, but that's arbitrary. We would take all of the products in a sense that now have high rates of protection, and we would still give them relatively higher rates of protection, but they would be significantly lower. And then the others, we would also lower to drastically simplify the system. Of course, the complaint or the argument will be made, well, where's the government supposed to get its revenue from? And the central message is tariffs are the wrong way to raise revenue. The right way to raise revenue is through broadly based taxes. The IMF is trying to reform the tax system. That, I think, is a move in the right direction. You need more income taxes. You may want to think about property taxes, but you do not want tariffs to be used primarily as a revenue-raising device. You might actually be surprised that flat tariff rates get you more money than very high tariff rates where you cut off the import supply. But nonetheless, you should not be using the tariffs for that purpose. The second point is, and why is simplification so important? Because what struck us when we work on Sri Lanka is that there is no rationale for these tariffs. They're all over the place. And in a sense, they're more accurately a history of who had political influence than they are of who is a great economic strategist. So we need to have a simple system. We need to have a simple system in order to say, unless there are exceptional circumstances, you'll get some tariff protection, but it's going to be simple. Personally, I would not be averse to saying 90% of the tariff should be in the simple schedule, and then there may be some exceptions, but they would be clearly understood exceptions. There would be two kinds. One would be for the firms that are going to have a huge amount of adjustment difficulty. In a sense, for those, you might say, we will move more slowly. We will use them implicitly as a safeguard. And a second group for the ones we really think have long-run growth potential. But there needs to be a credible argument made as to why, if you have opportunities in the domestic market, ultimately you could reach the scale economies that would make you globally competitive. And both of these exceptions should be very carefully monitored and to ensure that, in fact, they are meeting the goals and worthy of the exceptions. So I want to leave time for our discussion, and I'll end there. I hope I've convinced you, about the fundamental arguments for trade, and that the gains come from both specializing in the things you're different in, and in enjoying scale economies and a taste for variety. I hope I've also convinced you that there could be some case for infant industry protection, but it should be the exception, not the rule. It should be where you have a very strong and plausible argument that ultimately you could become globally competitive. And I hope that what I've convinced you of is that a tax on imports will ultimately be a tax on exports. And and that what you ought to be doing is to be reforming your tax system, trying to get simplification in order to help the political economy, and lowering the rates in order to stimulate your exports. And that ultimately is what we see in the evidence from other countries, and I firmly believe we would see in Sri Lanka if you moved in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. Now is the interesting time. You can raise questions, and you need not to wait till the mic reaches you. You can, if you see the screen, you can join us for the Q&A session through Slido. On Slido, you can, the event code is 9320. So you can log into Slido and post your question, so the moderator can see your question and you can vote for particular questions, so you need not to wait for the mic. However, we have two mic bearers. You can also raise questions from the audience, but I'll leave that the entire decision to Murtaza. Murtaza, over to you.
Thank you. I think you have your first question. Did you put up your hand? Maybe you can have a mic over here, please.
Professor, your contention is that exports from Sri Lanka have declined because of the tariffs. if I were to say that all tariffs, all taxes are rebated or exempted, what would your response be?
I do not, when you say rebated, there are various systems by which you rebate. So there's a whole administrative issue about the nature of the rebate. I don't want to say it's the only reason for the decline, but I am struck by the strong correlation. And I think there are many policy measures that need to be considered if we're thinking about stimulating exports in Sri Lanka. So I take the opportunity of your question to correct any misimpression I might leave that this is the one thing you need to do, and after that you sail off into the sunset. I think there are many ingredients to successful export performance, but I did want to highlight this particular one as being imperative. I also think, for instance, that the trade agreements that are being considered are very important. If you look at the access that firms based in Sri Lanka have to foreign markets compared to the access that firms have in other parts of the world, the firms in Sri Lanka have less access because it has not participated in opening markets for its exporters in other countries. I think, in addition, there's a huge amount of effort that needs to go into innovation. With the wage levels in Sri Lanka, you need to have products that are more innovative. And so I think there's a whole agenda that we've been working on. So I would say you got me if you interpreted what I said as being only the tariffs. But I wanted to highlight the tariffs because I do think they're a part of the solution.
I was in the Export Development Board for 17 years. And my contention is exports have declined because of the fact that investments or investors, the risk for investment has been very high due to various reasons. One reason is during the 30-year war, there were no investments. And in 2009, the war was won by the Sri Lankan forces, but the peace was not won. Therefore, the risk, one of the risks is the ethnic conflict has not been resolved yet. In fact, the OECD, in their country risk classification, says that previously the risk was 6 and currently the risk is 6. As against Afghanistan, 7 and 7. So the risk is one of the main factors that has to be resolved. Then secondly, the red tape.
I'm sorry, I have to say that you could ask questions and to differ from statements because we have to give an opportunity for others. Thank you.
Let me just add on this point of the risk. There is political risk, but we had a very interesting meeting today with people from many different industries in Sri Lanka. And there is a second risk which they face, and that is policy uncertainty. And so I would concur with the point about risk, but I would add that where you have a tariff structure that is continuously changing, the investors don't have the foggiest idea about what their long-run cost structure is. And what we heard from them was that perhaps they would rather have less protection, but secure protection. An environment that is secure with respect to policy is very critical and an important ingredient, and especially for foreign investors who are going to come here and have to take a long view. So I think policy uncertainty is another key ingredient.
But On the question or the statement that has been made here, I kind of disagree. There is a blue ribbon apparel company. A gentleman from that many years ago made a presentation, and he said that some of the biggest investments came during the darkest days of Sri Lanka, at the height of the JVP, etc., because they were partnering with firms. So international firms were partnering with great firms in Sri Lanka, and they felt their greatest risk was mitigated because they had good partners, and they worried less about the country risk. So I differ on that.
But they weren't partnering to export.
They were.
Well, why are the exports at the level they are? And when we see they weren't partnering to innovate in export areas, because we don't see much change in the composition of exports.
Yes, so that was mainly in the apparel, and this narrative is about 15 years ago. But that is to dispel the question about the risk, country risk, which I don't agree with. Maybe I can...
No, so let's distinguish, and I think it's important, between the generic country risk, which was being mentioned, and the other risks that are there in the environment.
Yes. So, Professor, maybe if you can explain to the benefit of the audience the link between exports and wages. Why export dynamism will lead to higher wages?
Well, basically, economic growth and increases in productivity are going to allow firms to pay higher wages. And it turns out, obviously, that your most productive firms are the ones who export. And we see a lot of empirical evidence. And it just makes sense, because if you're able to export, you have to be able to overcome the transactions costs that are much greater when they're involved in international trade. So a country that is geared towards exports is going to be more productive. I would also add that it could also be the case that the country that is getting out of its less efficient activities is also going to becoming more productive. So the transformation of the economy in a more efficient way is going to facilitate the ability of the labor market to generate higher wages.
The second question that I have is, there are many people who write that the solutions to Sri Lanka's trade deficit is to export more. Do you agree with that assertion? Would greater exports bridge the trade deficit, or would it further increase imports?
Well, you know, I have a problem because fundamentally, and a trade balance, basically the current account, is a reflection of the spending patterns of the nation. And it tells you a country with a deficit is borrowing. So it tells you that, in fact, it's not saving enough domestically, and it can't finance its own domestic investment. It has to borrow. It doesn't have enough high savings. So I see the trade balance as far more driven by spending patterns in the country. And one component of that would be fiscal policy. If the government saves more, if the government runs surpluses, the country will have a smaller trade deficit. If the private citizens save more, the country would have a smaller trade deficit. Those are the good ways, if you will, to lower the trade deficit. The bad way to lower the trade deficit is to invest less. That's another way to lower your trade deficit. So I think and by the way, let me say that my own country is following currently, the United States, utterly contradictory policies. Because while, as you pointed out, bilaterally, the Trump administration is obsessed with the bilateral deficits that we have with individual countries, so they're trying to make the aggregate trade deficit smaller. At the same time, what the US government has done is to pass large tax cuts, and is currently this week talking about increasing spending on defense and non-defense. So the government is going to run a bigger budget deficit. And so with its one side of its mouth, it's saying it wants a smaller deficit, and with the other side of its mouth, it's actually taking action that is going to lead us to a bigger deficit. So when it comes to the deficit, it seems to me much more about the spending patterns in the country, its saving and investment behavior, than whether or not it's going to export more or import less.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Professor, what is your view on Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement in increasing exports of Sri Lanka?
I'm sorry, just the last part of your question?
What is your view of Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement in terms of increasing exports of Sri Lanka?
Yeah. The reason I'm at Harvard is I hate making predictions. If I could see the future, I would be on Wall Street. I think so. I think that a free trade agreement with Singapore, as part of a broader strategy of signing free trade agreements, which would have a number of effects that I think would ultimately lead to more exports for Singapore. For Sri Lanka. The first is to make Sri Lanka a more attractive location for investment. If you can attract foreign investors who come here and are interested in producing here, not only to service your market, but also to service the Singapore market and global markets, then it will be successful. I think the other benefits of going through the exercise of undertaking a free trade agreement, particularly of the kind that you're going to sign with Singapore, is that it isn't only going to deal with the tariffs at the border, but it's going to require other kinds of changes in your domestic institutions. And the best kind of trade agreements are ones which get you to implement policies that are good for you in any case. One example, I think it is critical for this country to have a system of what are called trade remedies to deal with unfair trade. And I think as part and parcel of the agreement, there ought to be domestically measures put in place to deal with fair and unfair trade. I think in addition, there's a question of the transparency of government regulations. That's also something that can be part of this agreement. There's a requirement to meet certain standards and objective criteria for certain regulations, whether it's safety of food or technical barriers in products. So there's the possibility of e-commerce. So I think a broad trade agreement can then get you to re-examine your domestic political institutions, and ultimately I think those can also make you more competitive. So these are all reasons rarely mentioned, I might add, in the discussion about the trade agreement, but where I see a lot of the benefits. You have a follow-up? I can't hear you.
The factors you have mentioned, aren't they already part of the WTO trade facilitation agreement, which we have already ratified?
The WTO trade facilitation agreement is really about the operation of your customs. I'm talking about much broader dimensions, whether it is in the services sector or whether it's technical barriers to trade. Now, there is a WTO agreement on that, but again, by undertaking these free trade agreements that are deeper, it allows you to go beyond what's in the WTO agreement. In a sense, the kind of agreement you're signing with Singapore would be called a WTO plus agreement. And that's why I think it can enhance domestic reforms. So there is the trade facilitation agreement, but it's just, if you will, the lowest common denominator for trade facilitation. I think you can do much better in the free trade agreements.
Can
I have a
add?
question. Yeah.
Yes. The government tends to listen to people from Harvard who come and talk here. So the part that I find dangerous in this import and export argument, Taiwan and Japan, Korea, you mentioned China as well, they're importing more because they have industries that are doing value-added stuff and exporting them. So in Sri Lanka, we don't have development banks that lend money out like all those Asian tigers did. And as a result, we don't have industries. So making the tariffs disappear on raw materials that are imported will result in a net loss to the government in terms of revenue because there's no industries to now add value and export them. So are you all addressing the entire issue? Because obviously investments will come only in certain ways, private investors, but a lot of those countries developed because of development banks that gave long-term loans and took risks on industries that have become the base. So are you all addressing that is the question? Because just to speak about dropping import tariffs is part of the equation. Is that correct?
Well, I do think investment financing is a very critical issue. Whether your capital, I think you have quite sophisticated capital markets, but whether there's a need to supplement them with some governmental finance, you know, I think where there could be a plausible case made for that as well. I don't think that's the secret to the Asian success. There are many, many other countries who have investment banks, you know, who haven't grown that well. I think an outward orientation, though, is very critical. I think also it's hard to judge what you really are competitive in and what you really could add value in when you are putting these penalties on your firms by giving them costly inputs. So I have more optimism, I guess, than you do about the potential for the entrepreneurs of Sri Lanka to find profitable export opportunities if you create a favorable environment. Now, what I do also believe, if you look at the Asians, is that it wasn't simply the removal of the barriers to imports, and it wasn't simply providing finance, but there was very close collaboration between the firms and government, because government has a legitimate role in providing the necessary kind of public goods, whether it's the infrastructure or whether it's the training, that are important to export success. And that's something, when I look at the Korean experience or other Asian countries, Japan being another example, that's something that took place very effectively. And what I worry about in Sri Lanka is that I don't see a lot of partnership between the private sector and the public sector working for a common purpose in thinking about how the legitimate public role can actually be fulfilled. So I think there's a lot more in the policy arena that needs to be undertaken than the point that I was emphasizing. And so I would take your point about investment and an investment bank as just one example, but I think much broader collaboration in industrial policy approaches, not where the government replicates what the private sector should be doing, but where the government does invest in the things that the government needs to be doing.
I just wanted to make a comment with regard to that question. Maybe you can elaborate also. There is a myth that you have to be a domestic firm to export. Because if you take the example of Sri Lanka, even if you take the rubber industry, the leading exporters are not entirely Sri Lankan companies. They're all foreign companies who set up in Sri Lanka. And a few domestic companies learned of those companies, and today they're competitive. Similarly, in the late 1970s, when the apparel industry started, there were many Hong Kong-based companies, etc., who came and set up here, and that's how we got started. I believe that Malaysia tried to make a national car project, but Thailand allowed all the global companies to come. So Thailand is a big exporter of automobiles, but there are no Thai companies. And even the example that I gave for India, the export champions are all General Motors, Volkswagen, Suzuki. You want to take that line of argument to explain that it's not necessarily your domestic companies?
Oh, I agree. I agree completely. You know, what you need is know-how, and firms that are able to operate across national borders and still make a profit are the most efficient firms, i.e. the multinationals generally are the ones who have the most advanced technologies. Just take Singapore as the prime example of a country that has had a huge number of foreign investors. Now, what you would like is for the foreign investors to bring the know-how, for natives and domestic individuals and other firms to learn from them. And so they can not only create export opportunities, but can also serve to assist the domestic firms in entering foreign markets and in demonstrating where their profitable opportunities lie. So I think attracting foreign investment is a key ingredient. When we look at the data, we think there are far too few foreign firms in Sri Lanka, and actually far too few immigrants in Sri Lanka. You have a lot of people working around the world, but you know, if you look at and attracting them back is a key challenge, because you have a high number of talented people who can bring know-how back, but also you know, if you look at Silicon Valley driving the American information technology sector, what you discover is something like 30 or 40% of the leading entrepreneurs are not Native Americans, not born in the United States. Most of them come from Asia, but we've got Russians, we've got them from all over the world. And so I think an openness to immigrants is particularly talented ones, not only those who bring their money, but those who bring their knowledge, is a very key component of development and ultimately of excellence.
How many professors at the Kennedy School are non-Americans?
Well, I don't know the, you can hear from my accent, I'm a South African. You know, if I sit around the table when we have lunch, you know, I look and I see we got a Venezuelan, we got an Argentinian, we got someone from Turkey. There is an occasional American who manages to come in. But Harvard is in a sense a global institution and an example that you know, you try to find talent, and you find it wherever you think the best people are.
Professor, one question that I have before I put it back to the audience again is that we have this sense of value addition, that we have this national obsession that we have to add more value to our own raw materials and resources. Or even when we attract investment, we say that you've got to have a minimum value addition. What's your view on that?
Well, yes. I don't believe that. You see, it seems to follow, since value added per worker is high in a rich country, that what you ought to do is emphasize value added. But what's striking, and I didn't show you the picture, is that China seems to have gotten very, very rich or rather done rather well, by assembling components from other parts of the world. And so they started actually in a world of global supply chains, simply adding a small task, but doing it in great volume can accumulate into great value. And in essence, that's in a sense how the Chinese have generated a lot of their growth. So it isn't necessary, that's one point. A second, by the way, I said that para-tariffs is a word I think they invented in Sri Lanka. Well, in South Africa, my previous home country, they've invented a word called beneficiation. And what that word means is, and this is a very widespread notion in Africa, and maybe it is here too, and that is if we have the raw materials, we should be adding more value to our raw materials. There's something outrageous about the fact that we have the stuff in the ground, the foreigners come and take it out, and they're getting rich off our core products, and we need to add more value. Now, sometimes it makes economic sense. Sometimes there's a path that does lead from the raw material to a more processed product to some finished product, but not always. You know, if you know how to grow coffee, it doesn't mean you know how to operate Starbucks. So that at each stage of the vertical chain, of the value chain, sometimes you learn and you develop. But at other times, very different talents or requirements you need. Let me give you another example. Bauxite. Bauxite is the core raw material for aluminum. But it turns out that if you want to make aluminum, you need power. So the mere fact you've got bauxite in the ground doesn't mean to say you have the power sources that can turn it into aluminum. So the vertical thinking, the chain, of course, which thinks that automatically you should be adding value because you have the raw material, I don't think follows. It could be some cases, it might not be in others. And by the way, there's some other problem, which is if you think vertically like that, if we have copper ore, we should have copper, refined copper. Actually, what that means is your economy is going to be increasingly vulnerable to the price of copper. So they think that adding value makes them more diversified, but it actually makes them more concentrated and more dependent on the price of copper. If you have iron ore and then you go into steel, the same thing. So don't think vertically. The market works in mysterious ways. South Africa has become a major exporter of air conditioners. Now, how do they get good in air conditioners? Turns out it's from the gold mines. What do you mean it's from the gold mines that they learned how to make air conditioners? Yes, because it gets so hot down in the gold mine, 6 miles underground, that they had to develop air conditioners to cool the miners. And once they developed them, they suddenly found they had a comparative advantage or a competitive capacity in air conditioners. So the connections are not really easily predictable, and they're not always vertical. And the idea that we should always have a sequential value addition process, I think, is mistaken. I think rather you need people who can capture opportunities, and they can lie in strange places.
Okay, Professor, there is something called Slido, and we've got a whole bunch of questions on this, so this is like a rapid fire.
Okay.
Sri Lanka is finding it hard to narrow para-tariffs due to protests from local industries. Is there a better way Sri Lanka can convince these pro-protectionist lobbies?
I think you have to do it in a concerted and clear strategic way. If you try to take them on piecemeal and individually, you will lose the battles. And that's why I think without an ultimate goal of, say, 2 or 3 bans, and a transitional strategy to get there, you will have a lot of trouble taking on the sectors individually.
But when you show that effective tariff protection, it's almost like monopolistic power you're giving them, right? This is fine excess of protectionism, right? This argument, because when you have effective protectionism of 200, 300, 400%, that argument also doesn't come up, right?
No, so
It's excess protectionism, right? A business doesn't need that kind of protectionism.
correct. You're giving them huge subsidies, and they're going to fight like hell to try to keep them. And so the question, and this is more for you who understand your politics than me, but I actually believe that unless you have a kind of a concerted reform in which you agree on the principles and you agree on the goals, and then you're flexible on the timing, you're not going to get there. So I would prefer, rather than a big bang and then a lot of exceptions, a kind of a sure and steady path to ultimately get to that stage.
The next question is an anti-dumping legislation a boon or bane for domestic infant industries?
Well, there are two parts to that question. Look, the anti-dumping rules are not perfect. I would prefer to see the use of what we in America called antitrust rules and what the Europeans call competition policy in order to determine what's fair and unfair. But it could take quite a long time to implement a regime of antitrust laws in Sri Lanka. Until you get there, I think as a second best option, you need something to determine what's fair and unfair. I think without any rules, it's much more difficult to liberalize. And so I would kind of say, as a second best approach, I would use anti-dumping policies where foreign firms contravene those rules which have been established in the World Trade Organization. I would have some mechanism of implementing them. But I would not fool myself that that's an infant industry policy. Mm-hmm. That I'm doing, this is being occasioned by unfair practices of foreigners, and it says nothing about the ultimate potential of the domestic industry.
The next question is, can non-tariff barriers impede comparative advantage? How does a small country overcome these? And perhaps a lot of businessmen trying to export into India have complained about non-tariff barriers.
They have a legitimate complaint. It's a nightmare. Look, I think to some degree you can use the trade rules and the trade agreements to try to eliminate the most overt of these barriers. But what's very problematic in a country like India is that these can sometimes not be implemented from Delhi, but they are done at local levels, and they're very problematic and difficult to deal with. But I think to the degree that you can have rules, so that in a sense, if you're talking about sanitary standards, often these rules are used to keep out food products. To the degree that you have rules and you can pursue cases, you'll do better than if you don't. So I think it's a great challenge for the negotiators to try to deal with these issues, but they can be very significant obstacles.
Okay. The next question is on the lack of innovation. Is it simply that no one wants what we have? Is Sri Lanka the one country which doesn't have any comparative advantage?
No. No, I mean, look, you have some companies that I visited that sort of blew my mind in terms of how innovative they are. I mean, some of your clothing manufacturers, I went to Stretchline, and they are doing R&D and coming up with products, that are literally cutting edge. And you have scientists and you have researchers. I don't think you can't sit back and wait, but I don't see why you won't. I think you are innovative, and I don't see why you would underestimate the innovative potential in a favorable environment which rewards innovation. I think Sri Lanka will be an innovative place.
The next question is, how will Sri Lanka determine what sectors are good enough given that crops and textiles have been dominant exports?
I'm sorry.
I think the question is about how do you find what you can export next. So that's some of the Harvard work on Ricardo's work on.
Yeah, well, I don't think there are, it's sort of something that's easy to determine centrally. I think this is where you have to create an environment for the entrepreneurs to discover what can be profitably undertaken. I told you even in my simple example of comparative advantage that ultimately it depended on the market forces and the prices. And so I think you create an environment in which you encourage innovation, and then you've got to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't, now, you can build on some of your strengths, and I mean, there are some obvious areas. If you took tourism as a case in point, you know, it's obvious that you have to develop your tourist industry. You do have, if you took tea and you thought about, well, look at the example of Dilma, why is it that we don't have other estates that have branded their product in the same way? So we can look around and find some obvious easy wins, but I think ultimately what you want to do is let your entrepreneurs tell you where you're competitive.
There is some questions that I can sum up this way. I think in trade theory, there's this Balsa-Samuelson model that talks about the gains from trade. But there are some segments of society that gets left out, right? That cannot be retrained, etc. And there seems to be this movement about Brexit, what Trump is trying to do. What's your thinking, or what's the Harvard thinking on this?
Well, I had a slide I wanted to show you. We in the United States, if you look at earnings in the United States, what you see is that looking over time, some Americans have seen significant improvements in their income. Actually, women have seen significant improvements in their earnings. They're still paid less than men, but there has been significant improvements. Men with college degrees have seen significant improvements in their earnings. But men who don't have a college degree have barely seen any increase in their earnings for 50 years. So we have and they're not poor men. The median male is earning without a college degree is earning $40,000 a year. But they were earning $38,000 in 1970. So we have a significant group of people who have not enjoyed the fruits of economic growth. And when you have non-inclusive growth, you get a very potent and unhappy political force. And that's what we have in the United States. Now, the narrative which Donald Trump has come up with is it's all got to do with the bad trade agreements and the immigrants who have come into the United States. I think that's absolutely false. I don't believe that it has to do with international trade. Trade may have had some adverse effect on some workers, but nonetheless, non-inclusive growth, significant alienation of groups of people, you know, can result in an environment in which it is very difficult to undertake trade liberalization. But then, specifically for trade, I do think you have to think about policies and even technological change as well, about policies that can help those who are hurt. Whether it's an emphasis on retraining or on job placement, or even some forms of compensation for wage loss. I think the United States has been severely deficient in helping dislocated workers, and it's an area that is now leading to political problems and unrest. So we have to think about creative ways in all circumstances. Part and parcel of a liberalization agenda should be a trade adjustment assistance program.
In fact, I've seen a study that shows that more jobs have been lost due to automation than due to trade.
Yeah, I would say I'm writing a book on this topic, so I won't bore the audience. But basically, if you looked over the last since 2000, employment in American manufacturing declined by about 5.5 million. Our best estimates are that the jobs lost due to trade were about 1 million. So 80% of the jobs were not lost due to trade. What is it? It's a combination of more rapid productivity growth in goods combined with a rather unresponsive demand. When goods get cheaper, people say, this is terrific. You know, we saw it in food. Why is it we have so few farmers? Because we became more productive in farming, and people say, well, there's a limit to the amount I can eat. I'm going to take the money I save, and I'm going to spend it on goods and services. Well, we've got the same thing in manufacturing. As we've become more productive in manufacturing, people are saying, well, that's terrific. I'll buy a few more goods, but I'm going to take the money I save, and I'm going to spend it on services. So ultimately, we're making a transition into a services economy. But I would agree with the statement that the changes, the deindustrialization in the US, and indeed it's something that's prevalent in all industrial economies, is far more due to the combination of technology and the unresponsive demand to the technological improvements than it is to globalization.
Okay, just a few more questions. One question is they're asking is that why don't you just reform only the intermediate products?
Well, once you've reformed the intermediate products, what we've seen is that in turn raises the effective production of the finished products. So you have scope then to lower the tariff rates for the finished products without actually altering the amount of protection that those producers have. So I think there's an ideal opportunity in tariff reform to even retain some of the protection for the domestic industries while cheapening their inputs, to encouraging more exports and passing on some of the benefits to consumers. So I think there's a better mix of policies that you could adopt rather than just hold the tariffs at the same levels for the finished goods, because in effect what it means is you've raised their protection.
The other narrative that is commonly articulated is that these reforms will lead to large job losses. Can you give your experience of how it has played out in other countries? Whether the extent of the job losses can be offset by the consumer surplus that is gained?
Well, I think this is there. It all depends on the pace of change, and there can be job losses. I don't think you can deny that. And the real issue is, are there opportunities elsewhere for people to find employment? The only way you get the gains from trade is through adjustment. So specific jobs may well be lost. But ultimately, the total number of jobs in the economy should be driven by your macroeconomic policies. You should have, the central bank combined with your fiscal policy generating sufficient demand for labor. So there can be job loss. I'm not averse to saying you could have a safeguard policy in which you slow down the rate of liberalization where you see a lot of dislocation. That's what I urged earlier. So I would say, for 90%, I wouldn't change things. But if an industry comes along and it says, we can show that imports are causing a substantial amount of job loss in volumes that are very difficult to absorb, then I think you should slow down the rate of liberalization. It should be continuous, it should be declining over time, but you should cushion that adjustment threat.
My final question then is that, many of these decisions that you have raised, or many of the questions that you have raised, requires a significant amount of technical competency to argue these cases out, right? So the whole narrative has to move from a more emotional argument to a more factual one.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I wouldn't quite put it like that. I do think that reform requires political leadership, that it requires a vision and the ability to sell it in a way that ordinary people can understand. And that's not a skill an academic necessarily has. And it's not a skill that technical experts necessarily have. I worked for President Clinton, and he could explain the economics to ordinary people far better than his Council of Economic Advisors. So I don't underestimate the need for political skills and conveying in layman's terms a vision that people can understand. So I think in combination with the technical experts, you need the political leaders who know how to communicate the directions and the policies to people in order to convince them that you have a vision and you know where you're heading. So ultimately, it's not only about technical experts. It has to be accompanied by the political skills to sell reform. That's the package, I think, that can bring about effective change.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence and Murtaza. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen. However, we have a small token of appreciation to Professor Lawrence as well as for Murtaza. Of course, as I always say, I don't have any silver pins or Parker pens to impress a Harvard professor and a CEO of JB Securities, but we have a small token of appreciation. I would cordially invite Riyad Rifai, who is a volunteer for Advocata, to give these two tokens to Professor Lawrence and Murtaza Jafaji. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for giving us this wonderful session in this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. And final note is Advocata is a free market think tank. You can join us, you can support us, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, as well as in YouTube. And this session has been live streamed on citizen.lk as well as in our YouTube channel and on our Facebook. So if you miss any parts of this conversation, you can of course log into our Facebook channel and retrack what has been missing from your end. Until we see you again with a similar event, as I mentioned earlier, we have a series of projects focusing on protectionism, and that's the common theme and the main theme for 2018 for Advocata. With that, I'm signing off from here, and thank you very much for joining us, and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.